The water hung in the air for what felt like a full second before it hit her, a suspended arc of clear liquid caught in the harsh sodium light of the base's underground receiving bay. And in that stretched moment, no one in the loading area moved, no one breathed, no one seemed capable of accepting that what was about to happen was in fact happening. Then it landed. It struck her cheekbone, her jaw, the collar of her dark blazer, the front of her cream-colored blouse, and it ran in cold rivulets down her neck and into the fabric where it darkened and spread. The sergeant who had thrown it stood grinning, glass still tipped, the smile of a man who had not yet been informed that his life had just ended. Her name was Colonel, soon to be General, Naomi Whitfield, and she had arrived at Fort Kessler that morning at 7:42, exactly 18 minutes before her scheduled in-processing appointment, exactly the amount of early that told anyone paying attention that she had been in uniform for a long time. She was carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the seal of the executive office, an unremarkable government tissue laptop bag, and a lanyard she had not yet clipped to her lapel because she had wanted, for a few last quiet minutes, to walk through the facility she was about to command as a person and not as a title. She had learned long ago that titles distorted everything they touched. Titles made men straighten their spines and choose their words. Titles made rooms perform. She had wanted, one last time before the performance began, to see the room as it actually was. She had seen it now. She had seen it very, very clearly. The sergeant's name was Boyd Halloran, and he had been running the vehicle intake and check-in station at Fort Kessler for 11 years, long enough to have decided that the loading bay was his kingdom, and that everyone who passed through it was a subject to be sorted, processed, and when the mood struck him, entertained by. He had watched her walk in through the pedestrian gate with her laptop bag and her civilian blazer and no visible rank, and he had done what he always did when a black woman in civilian clothes appeared in his bay without a driver or an escort. He had made a joke about it to the two privates flanking the desk. He had made a louder joke about it as she approached. And when she had presented her identification card, face up, in the calm, even manner of someone who had presented that card at 300 checkpoints on 4 continents, he had barely glanced at it. He had said, without looking at her, that new admin hires were supposed to check in at the civilian personnel office on the north side of the base. He had said this in the tone reserved for correcting a child who had wandered into the wrong classroom. She had told him quietly that she was in the correct location. He had laughed, not a small laugh, a performing laugh pitched loud enough to include the privates, the 2 contractors near the loading dock, the corporal at the far desk, and the pair of visibly senior officers in Class A uniforms who had just stepped off the elevator behind her and had not yet been noticed. And then, still laughing, still performing, he had reached for the plastic tumbler of water at his elbow, and he had said the words that would replay on every major network in the country before the sun went down. "Welcome to the base, rookie. Try to keep up." And he had thrown the water in her face. The privates went rigid. The corporal at the far desk made a sound like a chair being scraped across concrete. The 2 senior officers behind her stopped walking. One of them, a 3-star lieutenant general named Arturo Mendez, who had known Naomi Whitfield for 22 years, felt his stomach drop through the floor of the receiving bay and into the concrete beneath it. He knew. He knew exactly what was standing 3 meters in front of him with water dripping from her jaw. He knew what Sergeant Halloran did not know, what no one in the bay except him and one other officer knew, which was that the woman he had just doused was the incoming installation commander. She did not wipe her face. She did not raise a hand to her cheek. She did not adjust her collar or acknowledge the water that had begun to pool in the small hollow above her collarbone and darken the pale silk of her blouse into something the color of wet stone. She simply stood exactly where she had been standing, portfolio still tucked against her side, laptop bag still hanging from her shoulder, her expression carrying no visible emotion at all. And this stillness, which lasted perhaps 4 seconds and which felt to the people watching like something closer to 4 minutes, was the first indication to Sergeant Halloran that he had made a miscalculation of a kind he had never made before. He was still grinning when the silence began, but the grin had already started to falter at the corners, the way a smile does when its audience has failed to reciprocate and the performer is not yet certain why. He looked at the privates. The privates were not looking at him. They were looking past him over his shoulder at the two senior officers who had stopped walking and were now standing very still by the elevator with expressions that Halloran had never seen on the faces of superior officers before, not in 11 years of watching brass move through his bay. He turned. He saw them. He did not yet fully understand what he was seeing, but something old and instinctive at the base of his spine had begun to signal to him that the room had shifted in a way that was not to his advantage. The corporal at the far desk, a young man named Ellis Reeves, who had been in the army for 3 years and who had learned in those 3 years to read a room the way certain people read weather, had already reached under his desk and pressed the small button that discreetly summoned the duty officer to the intake bay. He had done it without thinking, on pure reflex, the moment the water left the glass, and he had done it because he had recognized the woman the instant she had walked in, having spent 40 minutes the previous evening studying the biographical briefing packet that had been distributed to all senior enlisted personnel in preparation for the change of command ceremony scheduled for the following week. He had seen her photograph. He had read her service record. He had noted the 2 distinguished service medals, the Bronze Star with Valor device, the 3 combatant command tour, and the small line at the bottom of the packet that indicated her incoming assignment. And he had watched Sergeant Halloran, who had not read the briefing packet because Sergeant Halloran considered briefing packets to be optional reading for people who had time to waste, throw water in her face. He had pressed the button. He had also, without turning his head, activated the small body camera clipped to the front of his uniform pocket, which had been standard issue at Fort Kessler for 8 months, and which Sergeant Halloran had also never bothered to read the memo about. Naomi finally moved. It was not a large movement. She reached up, unhurried, with her right hand, and she touched the corner of her jaw where the water had run, and she brought her fingertips away and looked at them for a moment as though confirming to herself that what had just happened had in fact happened, that the physical reality of it was real. Then she lowered her hand. She looked at Sergeant Halloran. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, and there was in that look something that Halloran, who had spent 11 years reading the faces of the enlisted personnel and the junior officers and the frightened new recruits who passed through his kingdom, could not immediately identify, because he had never before been looked at by someone who was in the process of deciding, with unhurried precision, exactly what to do with him. Lieutenant General Mendez cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but it carried across the concrete bay like a door slamming shut. Halloran turned again, more sharply this time, and he saw the 3 stars on Mendez's shoulder for the first time, saw the ribbon rack, saw the second officer beside him, a colonel he did not recognize, and he began to understand that whatever he had walked into it very far, and he was not going to be able to walk back out. Mendez did not speak to Halloran. He walked past him directly to Naomi, and he stopped 1 pace short of her, and he came to attention, and he saluted. "General Whitfield," he said, "welcome to Fort Kessler." The word general landed in the bay the way certain words land in certain rooms, with a physical weight, a displacement of air that could be felt by everyone within hearing distance. Sergeant Halloran heard it, and his face, which had been flushed with the residual warmth of his own performance 30 seconds earlier, went through a rapid and visible sequence of color changes that concluded somewhere in the neighborhood of raw ash. The privates flanking his desk both took an involuntary half-step backward, the way people step back from something that has begun to smoke. The 2 contractors near the loading dock, who had been pretending very hard not to watch the incident unfold, stopped pretending. The corporal at the far desk, Ellis Reeves, kept his body camera running and his expression neutral, and his hands folded on the surface of his desk in the manner of a man who had decided, He was going to be a witness to whatever came next, and had no intention of being anything else. Naomi returned the salute. She did it the way she did everything, without flourish, the movement precise and unhurried, and when she lowered her hand she looked at Mendez and said quietly, "Archero, good to see you." Her voice was completely level. There was no tremor in it, no edge, no rising heat. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 31 years learning to keep her voice exactly where she wanted it regardless of what was being done to her, and who was not, on this particular morning, about to abandon 3 decades of discipline for the temporary satisfaction of raising it. Mendez looked at her collar, at the wet blouse, at the darkened silk. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. He turned his head very slightly and looked at Sergeant Halloran, and the look he gave him was the look of a man who was calculating in real time exactly how many careers were about to end in the next 6 hours and in what order. Then he looked back at Naomi. "Ma'am," he said, "would you like to proceed to your office, or would you prefer to handle this here?" She considered the question. It was, she understood, an offer of graciousness, a chance to move past the moment, to withdraw with her dignity intact and allow the machinery of military discipline to grind Sergeant Halloran into whatever it was going to grind him into without her having to stand in the concrete bay in a wet blouse while it happened. It was the polite option. It was the option that a great many women, having spent their careers being told that the price of promotion was the ability to absorb these moments without complaint, would have taken. She did not take it. "I'll handle it here," she said. Mendez nodded once. He stepped back 1 pace and to her left, which was the position of a subordinate who had just handed the room over to its rightful commander, and he clasped his hands behind his back and he waited. Naomi turned to face Sergeant Halloran. She did not move any closer to him than she already was. She did not need to. The distance between them, roughly 3 meters of stained concrete, felt to Halloran in that moment like the width of an ocean and also like nothing at all, like she was standing directly in front of him with her face 6 inches from his, and reading something from the interior of his skull that he had not authorized her to read. "Sergeant," she said, "what is your full name and duty station?" He tried to speak. The first attempt produced no sound. He cleared his throat, which came out as a small strangled cough, and he tried again. "Sergeant First Class Boyd Halloran, ma'am. Vehicle intake and check-in, Bravo Company Support Element, Fort Kessler. How long have you been in this assignment, Sergeant?" 11 years, ma'am. 11 years." She let the number sit in the air. It was not a rebuke. It was simply an acknowledgement, the way a doctor might repeat back a symptom to a patient before beginning to consider the diagnosis. "And in those 11 years, Sergeant, how many times have you thrown water in the face of a person entering this facility?" Halloran's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. Whatever answer he had prepared in his head, none of the available answers were survivable, and he knew it. And he understood in that moment that she knew he knew it, and that the question was not, in fact, a question. It was a mirror. He did not answer, because there was no answer he could give that would not make the situation worse than it already was, and Sergeant Halloran had at least enough operational sense remaining, buried under the wreckage of the last 90 seconds, to recognize a question designed to demonstrate that no answer existed. Naomi did not press him. She had not asked the question in order to receive an answer. She had asked it in order to make him hear himself trying to formulate one, and having accomplished that, she moved on. "Corporal Reeves," she said, without turning her head. Reeves stood up from behind his desk with a speed that would have been comic in any other context. "Ma'am, please contact the staff duty officer and request that the installation provost marshal report to this bay immediately. Then contact the command sergeant major and request that he do the same. Then contact my incoming aide, Major Chen, whose contact information you will find in the change of command packet distributed yesterday evening, and inform her that I will be delayed to my in-processing appointment by approximately 45 minutes. Do you have all of that, Corporal?" "Yes, ma'am." "Proceed." Reeves proceeded. He picked up the desk phone, and began making the calls with the efficient quiet of a young man who had just realized that his professionalism in the next 5 minutes was going to determine the trajectory of his career for the next 10 years, and who intended to take full advantage of the opportunity. Naomi turned back to Sergeant Halloran, who had not moved and who appeared at this point to be having difficulty remembering how his knees worked. "Sergeant Halloran," she said, "I am going to give you the courtesy of explaining to you exactly what is going to happen, because you are, whether you deserve it or not, a soldier, and soldiers are entitled to understand the consequences that are about to be applied to them. Is that acceptable to you, Sergeant?" "Yes, ma'am." "In approximately 4 minutes, the Provost Marshal will arrive in this bay. He will formally relieve you of your duty station. Your weapon, your ID card, and your access credentials will be collected. You will be escorted to the Provost Marshal's office, where you will be read your rights under Article 31 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and you will be informed of the charges under consideration, which will include, at minimum, assault on a superior commissioned officer, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. You will be permitted to contact counsel. You will be permitted to contact your family. You will not be permitted to return to your duty station or to this bay for any reason. Do you understand what I have just told you, Sergeant?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was a whisper now, the confident bass of 11 minutes ago reduced to something thin and dry that seemed to be having trouble finding purchase in his throat. "I want you to understand something else, Sergeant." She paused, and when she continued, her voice had gone quieter still, which had the paradoxical effect of making every person in the bay lean fractionally forward to catch it. "What is going to happen to you in the next several weeks is not, in the strictest sense, about me. I have had water thrown at me exactly twice in my life. The first time was in 1993, in a mess hall in Georgia, by a specialist who did not believe that women belonged in his infantry unit. The second time was 90 seconds ago. In the intervening 31 years, I have been called things and looked at in ways and passed over for assignments and quietly counseled by well-meaning superiors who thought I should temper my ambition. And I have absorbed all of it, Sergeant, because I made a decision very early in my career that I was going to reach the position I now occupy, and that in order to reach it, I was going to have to build a tolerance for indignities that my white male peers were never asked to build. I built it, Sergeant. I built it very well. And now I am standing in front of you and I am the installation commander, and the tolerance is no longer required because the position exists to make it unnecessary. Do you understand what I am telling you, Sergeant?" He nodded. He could not speak. "I need to hear the words, Sergeant." "Yes, ma'am, I understand." The Provost Marshal arrived at 7:58, which was 3 minutes and 40 seconds after Corporal Reeves had placed the call. A response time that would have been considered exceptional under any circumstances, and which suggested, to anyone who understood the internal signaling of a large military installation, that word of what had happened in the receiving bay had already begun to move through the base at a speed that outpaced official channels. He was a full colonel named Darren Whitcomb, a compact man in his early 50s with the flat gray eyes of an officer who had spent 20 years watching people do things they should not have done, and who had long since exhausted his capacity for surprise. He came through the pedestrian gate at a controlled walk, took in the scene in a single sweep, registered the 2-star general in front of him with a wet blouse and a portfolio, registered Lieutenant General Mendez standing at parade rest to her left, registered Sergeant Halloran approximately in the state of a man discovering that he had swallowed something poisonous, and he came directly to Naomi and saluted. "General Whitfield, Colonel Whitcomb. Sergeant Halloran is yours." "Yes, ma'am." That was the entire conversation. Whitcomb turned to Halloran with an expression that had not changed since he entered the bay, gestured to the 2 military police officers who had followed him through the gate, and the collection of Halloran's weapon and credentials began with the quiet efficiency of a procedure that had been rehearsed many times, though never, in Whitcomb's experience, for a soldier of Halloran's rank following an incident of Halloran's kind. The privates flanking Halloran's desk stepped aside without being asked. The two contractors near the loading dock had, by some silent mutual agreement, moved themselves approximately 10 meters further from the desk than they had been standing 3 minutes earlier, as though physical distance from the epicenter might inoculate them against being drawn into whatever came next. Halloran did not resist. He did not speak. He watched his sidearm come out of its holster and disappear into the hands of an MP whose name he did not know, and he watched his ID card lifted from his lanyard, and he watched his radio and his access fob, and the small brass whistle he had carried on his belt for 11 years all placed into a plastic evidence bag that was then sealed and labeled and initialed, and something behind his eyes, something that had been the animating center of him for all of those 11 years, dimmed and finally went out. He was escorted from the bay at 8:03. He did not look back at Naomi as he left. He could not have looked back at Naomi if he had tried, because the mechanism that would have allowed him to lift his head and meet her eyes had, for the moment, ceased to function. When the door closed behind him, the bay was very quiet. Naomi looked at Lieutenant General Mendez. "Archero, thank you." Then she looked at Corporal Reeves, who was still standing behind his desk with the posture of a man who was not certain whether he was still permitted to sit down. "Corporal, your conduct this morning was exemplary. I will remember it." "Ma'am, please continue with your duties." He sat down. Naomi turned to the two privates who had not moved and who were staring at the floor with the intensity of young men who were hopping very hard that they might, through the force of pure will, become invisible. "Privates," they snapped their eyes up, "you were witnesses to an incident this morning. In the next several hours, an investigator from the Office of the Staff Judge Advocate will approach you and request statements. You will provide those statements truthfully and completely. You will not omit anything you saw or heard because you believe it might reflect poorly on your former desk sergeant, on this company, or on this installation. Truth is not disloyalty, privates. Truth is the foundation of every functioning military unit that has ever existed. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." It came out as a single voice, perfectly synchronized, produced by two throats operating on identical instinct. "Good, carry on." She turned to Mendez. "Archero, walk with me. I need to change my blouse before the in-processing appointment, and I need to make 3 phone calls before I put on my class as, and I would like your read on the room before I meet the senior staff." "Yes, ma'am." They walked together toward the elevator. The bay behind them was silent. The morning had barely begun. They rode the elevator up in silence for the first 2 floors, the way officers who have known each other for decades often ride elevators, comfortable in the shared understanding that certain conversations require certain rooms and that a public elevator is not one of them. On the 3rd floor, a young lieutenant boarded, saw the 2 general officers, went briefly and visibly pale, and pressed himself against the back wall in the posture of a man who had accidentally wandered onto the wrong stage of a Broadway production. Mendez did not acknowledge him. Naomi gave him the smallest of nods, which the lieutenant returned with the careful precision of a soldier who was very aware that he had just been permitted to exist in a space he was not, strictly speaking, senior enough to occupy. He exited on the 4th floor. The doors closed. The elevator continued. "How many people saw it before we arrived?" Naomi said. "In the bay itself, 6. On the security feed, at least 3 in the operations center, possibly more." Reeves activated his body camera before the water left the glass. "The footage has been preserved. I made a call from the elevator on the way up." Mendez paused. "There is also, I regret to inform you, ma'am, the matter of the 2 contractors near the loading dock. One of them had a phone in his hand for a portion of the incident. I do not know what he recorded. I do not know what he intends to do with it." Naomi absorbed this. She had already assumed, in the moment the water was thrown, that the incident had been recorded by someone. She had spent enough of her career navigating the modern information environment to know that any event of significance occurring in a semi-public space in the presence of 6 or more people had a probability approaching certainty of being captured on at least one device. She had made her decisions about how to handle the situation with that assumption already built in. "Let it go," she said. "Whatever they recorded, they recorded. If it becomes public, it becomes public. We will not be chasing contractors around the parking lot trying to confiscate phones." "Yes, ma'am." "What is the composition of the senior staff briefing this morning?" 22 officers. 12 of them are your immediate command staff. The remaining 10 are the tenant unit commanders and their sergeants major. Colonel Bradford, the deputy commander, will be present. Command Sergeant Major Ortiz will be present. A brief hesitation. Colonel Bradford, ma'am, was reportedly not pleased about the change of command. Reportedly. He believed the position should have gone to him. He has been the deputy commander for 2 years. He has made his displeasure known through channels that were not, strictly speaking, official channels. I am aware of Colonel Bradford. Yes, ma'am. The elevator opened on the 8th floor. They stepped out into a hallway of polished institutional linoleum and framed photographs of previous installation commanders. All of them men, all of them white, all of them staring out of their frames with the settled confidence of people who had never once been asked to justify their presence in the corridor. Naomi walked past them without looking. She had seen versions of that hallway on every installation she had served on, and she had long ago made her peace with the fact that changing what was on the walls was a slower and less important project than changing what happened in the rooms. Her office suite was at the end of the corridor. The outer door bore a temporary paper sign that read Office of the Installation Commander in a font that had been printed that morning. The permanent brass plate with her name and rank was, she assumed, waiting to be affixed after the change of command ceremony the following week. She pushed the door open. Inside, a young captain rose from behind the reception desk with the alarmed alacrity of a subordinate who had been briefed to expect her in 45 minutes and had not accounted for the possibility that she might arrive early with a wet blouse and a 3-star lieutenant general in tow. "Major Chen sends her regards, ma'am. She is en route from the airfield. She should arrive within 20 minutes. Thank you, Captain. I will require a change of clothing before the senior staff briefing. There is a garment bag with my Class A uniform in the inner office, delivered yesterday. Please have it laid out. I will also require 10 minutes of privacy for phone calls." "Yes, ma'am." Naomi entered the inner office. Mendez followed. The door closed behind them. The inner office was a large corner room with tall windows that looked out over the parade ground, and beyond it, the low blue line of the mountains that marked the western edge of the installation. It had been stripped and prepared for its new occupant with the impersonal efficiency of a hotel suite between guests. The desk was empty except for a leather blotter and a single black telephone. The bookshelves were bare. The walls were freshly painted and, apart from the standard portrait of the president and the framed unit colors on the wall behind the desk, unadorned. A garment bag hung from a hook beside the interior door. Naomi crossed the room, unzipped the bag, and lifted out the Class A uniform blouse and skirt with the careful economy of a woman who had put on that uniform 10,000 times and had learned, at some point in the process, to treat it not as clothing but as an instrument. She hung the wet blouse on the back of the door. She would deal with it later. She would probably throw it away, though she had not yet decided. There was, she thought, an argument for keeping it. There was also an argument for not keeping it, for not preserving the physical artifact of the morning, for allowing what had happened to exist only in the record and in her memory, and not in the closet of her quarters where it would sit for years as a small, dark reminder of a moment she had already decided she was not going to carry as a weight. She would decide later. Mendez stood by the window with his back turned, giving her the privacy of the room to change, without making the elaborate performance of leaving it. They had known each other since she was a captain and he was a major, since a base in Germany in the mid-1990s, where they had both been junior officers assigned to a joint operations planning cell, and the professional intimacy that had accumulated between them over the ensuing 3 decades had long since arrived at the point where he could stand in her office with his back turned, while she changed her uniform, and neither of them needed to comment on it. "Archero," she said, buttoning the fresh blouse, "talk to me about Bradford." Mendez did not turn from the window. "He is competent. His officer evaluation reports are consistently above average. He has commanded at battalion and brigade level with no significant deficiencies. He was on the short list for this position, and he had reason to believe, based on informal signals from the previous installation commander, that he was the likely selectee. When the announcement came down nomming you instead, he was, by several accounts, publicly displeased in the officers' club. He has since regained his composure in public settings. Privately, I understand he has been less measured. Sources: 2 lieutenant colonels on his staff. One of them was in my command a year ago. She has kept in touch. She reached out to me last week when the announcement was made." Naomi finished the buttons. She lifted the Class A jacket from the garment bag and slid her arms into the sleeves. The ribbon rack on the left breast caught the morning light and threw it back in small, hard glitters. 3 rows of decorations that told, to anyone who could read them, the compressed biography of a 31-year career. She adjusted the jacket, straightened the collar, and reached for the general officer's belt with its polished buckle. "Is he going to be a problem, Archero?" "He is going to try to be a problem, ma'am. Whether he succeeds is a different question, and the answer to that question depends on how you handle him in the first 48 hours. Recommendations." Mendez turned from the window. His face was thoughtful, unhurried. "Do not confront him publicly. Do not humiliate him. Do not, above all, allow him to become the story. What happened in the bay this morning is going to be a story whether we want it to be or not, and every energy that the command devotes to managing that story is energy that is not being devoted to running the installation. Bradford will want to make himself part of the story. He will want to position himself as the steady hand, the institutional continuity, the officer who was passed over unfairly and is now graciously supporting the new commander. Do not give him that space. Give him a mission. Give him something that requires his full attention, and that removes him from the internal politics of the headquarters for the next 30 days. Naomi fastened the buckle of the general officer's belt and stepped in front of the small mirror mounted on the interior of the closet door. She adjusted the alignment of her name tape, checked the position of the 2 stars on each shoulder, and studied her reflection for a long moment with the appraising eye of a commander inspecting a subordinate. The woman in the mirror looked composed, unhurried, entirely herself. Nothing in the reflection suggested that she had been assaulted by a non-commissioned officer in a concrete receiving bay 90 minutes earlier. That was, she thought, either a professional achievement or a personal cost, and she had long ago stopped trying to distinguish between the two. "I concur," she said. "Draft the mission for Bradford by 1500. Something real, something that matters, something that keeps him out of the headquarters for the next 30 days. The joint readiness exercise coming up in November has been under-resourced from the planning side. Put him in charge of the installation's contribution. Full authority, full accountability, direct report to me. He will either rise to it or he will fail publicly on his own terms, and either outcome is acceptable." "Yes, ma'am." She picked up the black telephone on the desk and dialed a number from memory. The call was answered on the second ring by a woman whose voice carried the specific clipped efficiency of a very senior civilian assistant. "Office of the Secretary. This is General Whitfield. I need 3 minutes with the Secretary at his earliest convenience today." "One moment, ma'am." The moment stretched to perhaps 40 seconds. Then a different voice came on the line, deeper, older, the voice of a man who had been holding senior positions in the defense establishment for longer than most of the officers under his authority had been in uniform. "Naomi, I have been informed." "Yes, sir." "Are you all right?" "I am, sir. I wanted to reach you directly before the story develops through other channels, which it will. I have handled the incident at the installation level. The soldier has been relieved and is in the custody of the provost marshal. Charges are being drafted. I will provide a full written report by close of business. Do you need anything from this office?" "No, sir. I need this office to allow the installation to handle this matter through the ordinary machinery of military justice, without external intervention or public statement from higher headquarters, for at least the next 72 hours. If the story becomes public, and I assess that it will, the department's response should be brief, factual, and confident in the ability of the installation command to manage the situation. Anything more elaborate will suggest that this is a crisis rather than an incident, and I would prefer that we not, by the shape of our own response, confirm the wrong framing. There was a pause on the line. Then the secretary said, very quietly, "Naomi, this is why the position went to you and not to Bradford." "Yes, sir. You will have what you have asked for. Handle it." "Thank you, sir." She replaced the receiver. She looked at Mendez, who was watching her with the expression of a man who had just witnessed a demonstration of institutional competence at a level he had rarely encountered even at his rank, and who was not certain whether he wanted to applaud or simply be grateful he had been in the room to see it. "Archero, let us go meet the senior staff." They walked back to the outer office. Major Chen, Naomi's incoming aide, had arrived and was standing beside the reception desk with a folder and a coffee, and the wound-tight readiness of an officer whose first day as the aide to a two-star general had, without warning, become historically complicated. Naomi greeted her by name, accepted the folder, glanced at the top page, and moved past her toward the corridor at a controlled walk. Mendez and Chen fell in behind her, one on each side and half a step back, and the small procession moved down the polished linoleum toward the conference room at the far end of the 8th floor, where 22 officers were already seated and waiting and had, by some quiet and rapid distribution of information, all of them heard by now what had happened in the receiving bay at 7:42 that morning. The conference room door was open. Naomi did not slow. She walked directly through it, and every officer in the room stood at once. The conference room was long and rectangular and dominated by a polished wooden table around which 22 officers now stood in a silence so complete that the small hum of the ventilation system in the ceiling had become audible for the first time in perhaps years. The morning light came in through the eastern windows and fell in long panels across the table and across the faces of the men and women arrayed on either side of it. And each of those faces had arranged itself into the studied neutrality of a professional who had heard something they were not supposed to have heard, and had decided, in the 4 minutes since hearing it, to give no indication that they had heard it at all. Naomi walked to the head of the table and set the folder Major Chen had given her on the polished wood. She looked around the room. She did not sit down. "Good morning." "Good morning, ma'am," came back the response, 22 voices in rough unison, the volume calibrated to the specific occasion of a first meeting with a new commander whose reputation had preceded her and whose morning had apparently exceeded even that reputation. "Please be seated." They sat. Naomi remained standing. She placed her hands on the back of the leather chair at the head of the table and did not lean on it. She looked around the room again, more slowly this time, meeting the eyes of each officer in turn, and every officer she looked at returned the look for as long as she held it, and then looked away only when she released them, which was the correct response and which she had, without saying so, just verified in 22 individual small assessments that would inform every conversation she had with each of them for the next 2 years. She stopped on Colonel Bradford. He was seated at her right hand, which was the position of the deputy commander, and which he had presumably been occupying at these meetings for 2 years. He was a tall, lean man with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of jawline that suggested a lifetime of discipline in front of mirrors, and his face was arranged into an expression of respectful attentiveness that was, Naomi observed, almost but not quite perfect. There was a small tension at the corners of his mouth that told her he had been rehearsing that expression for at least the last hour, and that the rehearsal, however diligent, had not fully concealed the underlying architecture of his displeasure. She held his gaze for perhaps 2 seconds longer than she had held anyone else's. Then she released it and looked at the room as a whole. "I had intended," she said, "to begin this meeting by introducing myself, walking you through my command philosophy and outlining the priorities I have identified for the first 90 days of my tenure as the commander of this installation. I will still do those things. But before I do, I want to address directly and briefly the incident that occurred in the vehicle intake bay at 7:42 this morning, because I know that most of you have heard about it, some of you have heard incomplete versions of it, and all of you are going to be asked about it in the coming days by subordinates, peers, spouses, journalists, and possibly members of Congress. The room was very still. Here is what happened. I arrived at the intake bay in civilian clothes, without a uniform and without visible rank, because I wanted to walk through the ordinary and processing routine of this installation, the way an ordinary new arrival would experience it. Sergeant First Class Boyd Halloran, the desk sergeant on duty, did not recognize me. He made a series of assumptions about who I was based on my appearance. He acted on those assumptions in a manner that was demeaning, unprofessional, and physically inappropriate. He has been relieved of duty, remanded to the custody of the Provost Marshal, and is currently being processed under Article 31. Charges will be filed by close of business today. She paused. She looked around the room again. I want to be clear with all of you about what this incident is and what it is not. It is not about me. It is not about race. It is not about gender. It is not about the personal failings of one non-commissioned officer, though those failings are real and will be addressed. It is about culture. It is about the culture of this installation, and about what the men and women assigned to this base have learned. Over years of unexamined practice, they are permitted to do to the people who walk through our gates. I have commanded soldiers in 4 combatant commands, she continued. I have served in units where the culture was excellent and in units where the culture was not, and I have learned over 31 years that the difference between the two is almost never a matter of policy. Policies are the same across the Army. Regulations are the same. The Uniform Code of Military Justice applies identically at every installation on every continent. The difference between a unit whose culture is excellent and a unit whose culture is not is a matter of what the people in that unit have learned. By watching what happens and what does not happen, they can get away with. Sergeant Halloran learned, over 11 years of running a desk in a receiving bay, that he could speak to and treat certain kinds of arrivals in certain kinds of ways, and no one would stop him. That is not a personal failing. That is an institutional failing. And every officer in this room, whether you were present in that bay this morning or not, is partially responsible for the environment in which that lesson became learnable. No one moved. Colonel Bradford was studying the surface of the table with the particular concentration of a man who was very aware that certain sentences in the preceding paragraph applied to him, and who was declining, for the moment, to make eye contact with anyone who might confirm that awareness. "Here is what I expect from each of you," Naomi said. "I expect you to run your commands as though every person who walks through your gate might be your commanding general in civilian clothes, and to run them exactly the same way when you are certain that person is not. I expect you to interrupt indignity when you see it, without waiting to be told, without calculating whether the interruption might cost you politically, and without imagining that silence is a neutral position. Silence is not neutral. Silence is complicity, and complicity is a form of command, and command failures at the small level become command failures at the large level with a reliability I have watched play out on 4 continents. I expect you to understand that dignity is not a soft skill. It is a combat multiplier. Units whose soldiers are treated as human beings by their leaders and by each other fight better, retain better, recruit better, and recover from setbacks better than units in which that is not the case. This is not sentiment. This is data. I have 31 years of it. I will share the data with any of you who would like to see it." She paused. She looked at each officer in the room again, one at a time. "That is the end of what I have to say about this morning. We will not discuss it again in this forum. If any of you wish to discuss it with me privately, my door is open. The next meeting of this staff will occur at 0800 on Monday, at which time I will present my command philosophy and initial priorities in detail. Between now and then, Colonel Bradford will receive a mission tasking that will occupy the majority of his attention for the next 30 days. Major Chen will distribute individual meeting slots for each of you over the course of the next 2 weeks. In those meetings, I will ask each of you the same 3 questions. I recommend you begin thinking about your answers now. She sat down. She opened the folder Major Chen had given her. Colonel Ramirez, please begin the operations brief. The meeting proceeded. The morning proceeded. The video from Corporal Reeves's body camera and from the phone of the contractor by the loading dock would reach the national news cycle by the end of the day, and Naomi Whitfield's name would be spoken on every network by nightfall, and the installation would be studied and written about and discussed in command staff colleges for years afterward. Sergeant Halloran would be court-martialed and reduced in rank and separated from the service, and Colonel Bradford would eventually retire quietly at his current rank, and Corporal Reeves would be selected for officer candidate school on Naomi's personal recommendation. All of that lay ahead. None of it was, in the moment she sat down and opened the folder, her concern. Her concern was the installation and the 22 officers in front of her and the work. If this story moved you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe every person deserves to be treated with dignity before they've proven a single thing, type the word dignity in the comments so we know you're with us. Peace.